Wayne Christian. Welcome to this report of the Texas Legislative Update. Today we have a friend that I respect for his work for a number of years. Currently, he is the Director for Fiscal Policy Center at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and that's former Representative Talmadge Heflin. And let me say one thing, Talmadge, that I can say that is, I believe, something I would be honored if anybody said this about me. When I was in doubt and came to this legislature for literally the first 2 or 3 sessions, when I didn't know what to vote for, I'd look up at that board and just kind of was uncertain. I would look at what Talmadge Heflin was voting, and I'd try to follow your vote. I respect you tremendously, and I honored you to take the time to be with us today.
Well, thank you, Wayne. That is a compliment, and I take it just as that. But thank you very much for that.
Well,
glad to be with you.
We're glad to have some conservative folk, and Talmadge leading that center over at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. One issue that's everybody's talking about now is use of the rainy day fund. Mm-hmm. What is the rainy day fund?
Well, the rainy day fund was created in 1988 by the legislature after a significant downturn in the economy, and it was created to be able to put money in when times were good, so that when times were not good, it could help level the budget playing field, if you will, on that.
Hey, Mr. Heflin, where does the rainy day fund get its money from?
Wayne, there's 2 sources. One is excess oil and gas money. In other words, that money above what it brought in 1987. And the second place is excess funds at the end of the biennium. Half of that money that's unencumbered can go into the rainy day, will go into the rainy day fund. The third place is the legislature can appropriate money directly to the fund, but they've never done it.
Mr. Heflin, how do we spend the rainy day fund? Who makes that decision?
Wayne, the legislature votes to spend the rainy day fund. With a 2/3 vote, they can spend the rainy day fund for any purpose, and that 2/3 vote in the House is 100 votes. I believe you have about 101 votes that are somewhat conservative.
So, Talmadge, you've studied the Public Policy Foundation. You've been appropriations chairman in this place. So you understand this problem from the bottom, inside and outside in. And looking at the situation now, what is your recommendation for the legislature?
Our recommendation to the legislature is to not use the rainy day fund, especially until they have seen that there is no other way to balance the budget. So our recommendation is leave the rainy day fund intact. We know it's important for bond ratings to leave at least 5% of the general revenue for the current biennium in the fund. We've got more than that now, but we believe the budget can be balanced without using the rainy day fund, and the comptroller, we believe, has the capability of covering short-term deficits without using the fund. So our recommendation is leave it intact.
I think Arlene Wilgemuth, our good friend that's also with you in the Texas Public Policy Foundation, mentioned the other day at a breakfast we attended that next session might be worse than this session. What are some of the things y'all are looking at in the horizon ahead of why we should maintain some rainy day fund for the next session?
One of the things that we believe is, in fact, our research shows that Medicaid will require an additional, over and above what you're currently putting into it, $15.5 billion just to cover those that call on the service. That's nearly twice what we're spending now. The rainy day fund is only $9.4 billion, or anticipated being that. So that's a hole bigger than that fund could cover if you don't spend a dime of it. And so that's just one thing.
And that's something we're not even looking at now. So all this other on top of what the shortage we're seeing now may be looked at next session.
So if you spend the money now and you go into that session with $15 billion in the hole in one program, guess what you're going to be asked to do?
Exactly.
I'm not even going to say the word.
I guarantee you.
Right.
They're going to want it. And that's the first thing. A lot of times they look at those of us that are trying to be conservative, look for other options to bring income into the state. or
Right.
to look for different ways to change the situation. You I believe, work with Art Laffer, who is a research
Right.
person you work with, and Dr. Laffer was kind of an economic advisor to a gentleman that we all respect, President Ronald Reagan.
Right.
And a lot of the information you use there comes from him. Can you give us some suggestions on what you feel in attacking this particular shortfall we should look at before we start looking at the rainy day fund?
Well, you need to look at leaving every penny you can with the private sector. The studies that Dr. Laffer has done for us shows that if you will leave the money in the private sector, they will create jobs. For every dollar that the government takes out of the private sector to spend, we talk about, well, if the government spends $1, it turns 3 times. So you get a real economic boost. The facts are that if the private sector spends $1, you get about a 3-time roll on it, or return. If the government spends that dollar, you get a 0.7 return. You don't even get your dollar back, because government is a user. They're not a generator of wealth. The private sector generates wealth, and that comes from a man that knows economics.
Yeah, I heard one wise person mentioning that anything the government buys, they're a third-party purchase, and a third-party purchaser, which means they are not really concerned about the quality, the
Right.
quantity, and they are not going to be affected by how that dollar's spent.
That's exactly
Which means they don't have a real interest in watching how every dollar goes. Whereas a private sector or a family as such,
Right.
we are definitely selective of what we buy, the quality, and that the dollar goes as far as it can. And so that in itself tells me that as much as you can hand to the private sector, the better off you'll be.
Right. And, one of the things in balancing the budgets you need to really look at is what is it that the government is currently doing the private sector can do? Because we know that, just as you pointed out, the return will be greater, and it actually be generating wealth, even though it may be being sold to the government or provided for by the private sector. You still get that wealth generation from it. You also need to look at some of the agencies that are redundant, doing things redundant to other agencies, or something that may be being handled locally, and the state is piling on top of it.
And that makes me think what you're talking about here is, why do we start every session as if we had to do it all exactly as we did the last session? In other words, it's like we have to build on top of what they did last time.
Right.
And I think that philosophy is destructive to economics in our state.
Well, you never correct mistakes that you make. We know that when the legislature comes to town and they dealing with several thousand bills, they'll probably pass over 1,000. Some mistakes are going to be made. And when you have a funding mentality like that, you never get a chance to correct your mistakes.
Talmadge Heflin, Director of the Savings Department at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, I always miss that part, the fiscal policy, who's been served in the Texas legislature for a number of years, a fellow that kept us all on the right side of the road economically, was appropriations chairman, have been at the top in both the private and public sector up here. Thank you for being a part of our program today.
My pleasure.
And for sharing your opinion with us.
Thank you, Wayne, for having me on.
And this is the Texas Legislative Update. Wayne Christian, we'll see you later.
You can go to texaspolicy.com, and all of our work, both current and past, is there on the site. It's archived, and every time we put out a publication, you can find it on www.texaspolicy.com. We hope you'll visit us.
You know, what I'm proud of is in previous sessions of which I was honored to be a part, the Texas Conservative Coalition, which at the time I was honored to be chairman, visited with the then appropriations chairman and the Speaker of the House in a meeting, and we made it very clear. It was released in the press the following day that we would not touch the rainy day fund because we as the Conservative Coalition refused to vote for the budget if they did that. So that's why it's so important to be very frugal with the rainy day fund. Also, the releasing of evidence that we're going to see additional cost in future sessions, that we're going to need some savings. It's why I think we need to be very frugal with the rainy day fund and ask legislators in this session to make it the last choice and save it as much as possible.